That's a 10. That's a good one. Yeah.
In this video, we will tell you how America's largest retailer, Walmart, has been caught up in a real economic storm that threatens to change the way millions of ordinary people live. Imagine this: prices for essential goods are rising so fast that ordinary families are already having to rethink their budgets and give up things that seemed affordable yesterday. All this is the result of a tense trade war that has unfolded over the harsh tariffs imposed by the Donald Trump administration.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
But did you know that the administration itself tried to force Walmart to simply keep quiet and swallow these costs? As if the company should take the financial hit for the sake of patriotism and not bother shoppers with the real facts. This order caused a real scandal both within the corporation and beyond. We'll tell you how Walmart found itself between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it couldn't ignore rising costs, and on the other, it was under pressure from the president, who publicly threatened them for being honest.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
Hundreds of thousands of families across the country are already facing the consequences. People in rural areas, workers in the Midwest, and single parents are forced to cut back on food, switch from familiar brands to cheaper alternatives, and give up the little things that make life more comfortable. All this is happening against a backdrop of loud promises to bring back jobs, protect Americans, and break China's economic influence. But instead of improvements, there has been a sharp rise in the price of everyday goods. Experts are sounding the alarm. These tariffs are not just government policy, but a hidden tax paid by end consumers.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's two ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
According to leading economists, the average American household has already lost nearly $3,000 in purchasing power in the last year alone. And if Walmart, with its vast resources and bargaining power, cannot keep prices down, what can the rest of us expect? Small shops and regional retailers simply will not survive such a battle. Meanwhile, cracks are beginning to appear within the US political elite. Even among Republicans, there are a growing number who understand that tariffs are turning against the very people they bet on during the election. We will discuss how growing discontent among voters is already beginning to affect the political landscape and could have serious consequences in the next election.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Finally, we will look at how the international community is reacting to this conflict. The international media is calling what is happening economic bullying, and investors are watching the fall of the largest US company's shares with concern. If Walmart is losing ground, then the alarm bells are ringing for the entire economy. What will happen next? How will the lives of millions of ordinary Americans change? And can this process be stopped before it is too late? Stay with us to learn the whole truth about how tariff policy has become an economic trap for consumers and why the price ordinary people pay is much higher than it seems at first glance. This conflict is not just a trade war, it is a struggle for the welfare of an entire country, and the consequences will be felt for a very long time. Get ready for a tough analysis and unexpected facts that are sure to surprise you.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
Walmart, America's largest retail giant, has been forced to announce a massive price increase for the first time in its history. And the reason for this decision is the new tariffs imposed by the Donald Trump administration. These tariffs, aimed at imports from China, Mexico, and other key trading partners, was so significant that the company simply could not keep prices at the same level. The retailer, with its multi-billion-dollar turnover and enormous market influence, faced an unprecedented economic dilemma: either take a hit to its financial performance or pass some of the costs on to consumers.
Tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
At first, Walmart tried to minimize the damage by reviewing its supply chains, cutting logistics costs, and even canceling some non-essential projects to maintain the previous price levels for essential goods. The company's management did everything possible to maintain stability on store shelves, especially in the fresh produce section, where price increases would be most painful for customers. However, with the back-to-school season approaching, it became clear that prices for many categories of goods, such as clothing, footwear, school supplies, and electronics, would inevitably rise. This decision, though painful, was dictated by the reality of tight retail margins, which simply did not allow Walmart to absorb the additional costs associated with the new tariffs. Walmart publicly stated that the price increases would be gradual, starting at the end of May, and that the company would do everything possible to keep price increases within reasonable limits. But within the company, it was understood that this measure would only be the beginning, as shipments were already being delayed at customs due to the new tariffs. And the ultimate effect of these additional costs would inevitably be felt by consumers. Sources within Walmart even reported that measures were being discussed to change the product range, reducing the number of goods dependent on imports and increasing the focus on local producers in an attempt to reduce dependence on foreign supplies. However, this strategy was far from ideal and could not fully offset the losses.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
At the same time, the Trump administration was not just watching these processes unfold. The president made demands of Walmart and other major retailers. In a series of harsh messages on social media, he accused the company of raising prices and passing the responsibility for tariffs onto consumers. Trump demanded that Walmart eat these costs and not raise prices, calling on the company to show patriotism and support for the national economy. These statements were written in the former president's characteristic manner, with a sense of entitlement and threat. He stated that he was closely monitoring the situation and warned that shoppers would also be watching the retailer's every move. However, this public order was bound to cause an internal crisis. Walmart's management found itself in a difficult situation. On the one hand, it wanted to maintain its reputation and the loyalty of millions of customers, and on the other, it had an economic need to raise prices. Some insiders said that heated discussions and even disputes had broken out within the company between the finance department and the public relations department. some managers were in favor of openly and honestly telling customers about the reasons for the price increases, including tariffs, while others insisted on a more cautious and diplomatic approach so as not to provoke conflict with the White House and damage the company's image. In the end, Walmart chose transparency, but with restraint. The company issued an official statement emphasizing that it was trying to keep prices as low as possible, but that the scale of tariffs and narrow retail margins made price increases inevitable. Particular attention was paid to the fact that the increase would primarily affect non-food items such as shoes, clothing, school supplies, and electronics, but while food items such as bananas, coffee, and avocados would be protected from sharp price hikes for the time being. Nevertheless, this was an acknowledgement of a reality that could not be hidden.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
The reaction to Walmart's statements was immediate and mixed. The Trump administration accused the company of trying to shift the blame for price increases onto tariffs rather than internal management decisions. The president claimed that Walmart was able to absorb these costs, given its huge profits in the previous year. His tone was commanding and demanding keep prices down, be patriotic, don't mislead customers. Many observers saw this as public pressure aimed at preventing companies from speaking uncomfortable economic truths. Meanwhile, within the corporation itself, management understood that the market and shoppers were already beginning to feel the effects of the tariffs. Store employees surveyed reported that customers were increasingly complaining about price increases, abandoning their usual purchases, and looking for cheaper alternatives. Stories about putting off school purchases or giving up favorite products became increasingly frequent and alarming. In some regions, especially rural and working-class areas where Walmart is the main or only place to shop, these changes are perceived as a personal blow to the budget.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Thus, the situation with price increases at Walmart has become a symbol of a broader problem caused by the Trump administration's trade policy. This is not just a local incident, but a reflection of large-scale economic processes where tariffs intended to protect domestic production turn into additional costs for the end consumer. Walmart was the first major company to publicly acknowledge that tariffs cannot simply be ignored and that the consequences will be felt by all segments of society. This conflict became the starting point for serious changes in the U.S. economy, which we will discuss further. Under intense scrutiny from the public and the Trump administration, Walmart responded to the criticism in a fairly measured manner, while firmly confirming the economic reality it faces. The company issued an official statement emphasizing that, despite all its efforts, it had become virtually impossible to maintain the previous prices for imported goods. Internal reports leaked to the press showed that the cost of importing goods had risen by 15 to 20%, which directly affects retail prices. Walmart representatives emphasized that the increase would not affect the entire range of products, but primarily those goods on which tariffs exert the greatest pressure: clothing, footwear, electronics, and school supplies. At the same time, the company promised to minimize price increases for food products, trying to protect customers from sharp increases in the cost of basic products. However, even this attempt was a sign that the pressure from tariffs was already too great to ignore. There was growing activity on social media, where residents shared their stories about how rising prices for everyday goods were affecting their lives. Online communities and support groups sprang up, where people shared tips on how to save money and survive in the new conditions. Some bloggers and journalists began to compare the situation to an economic crisis, arguing that without timely intervention, the consequences could be much more serious. Against this backdrop, the first calls for a review of the tariff policy began to emerge, which became a topic of discussion in political forums and the media. Thus, the situation surrounding Walmart's price increases became not just an economic problem, but a factor capable of changing the social climate and political landscape. The retailer, trying to maintain a balance between financial realities and consumer expectations, but found itself at the forefront of the struggle for stability in the American consumer market. At the same time, shoppers, mostly from the working class, were forced to rethink their habits and expectations. These changes have become a symbol of deeper processes taking place in the country's economy under pressure from external and internal factors, and their consequences will be felt for a long time to come. The mounting pressure of Donald Trump's tariff policy is having not only economic but also serious political consequences. Cracks are beginning to appear within the Republican Party that were previously hidden behind a facade of unity. Some lawmakers, especially those from regions where Walmart's influence is particularly strong and where voters are already feeling the real effects of price increases, have begun to openly express doubts about the wisdom and effectiveness of the current tariff strategy. These politicians understand that further escalation of the trade war threatens not only to worsen the economic situation, but also to undermine support among key voter groups: workers, middle-class families, and rural residents who were the main target of the election campaign. Several influential Republicans have publicly criticized the tariffs and called on the administration to reconsider its approach to trade policy. According to insiders, there are fierce debates in the corridors of Congress on how to mitigate the impact on consumers, preserve jobs, and at the same time not weaken America's position on the international stage. At the same time, supporters of the tariffs, including some figures close to Trump, insist on continuing the hard line, arguing that it is necessary to protect domestic industry and create jobs within the country. These contradictions create a real risk of internal division and could significantly influence the political course in the coming years. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, a number of Republican lawmakers have begun to engage more actively with the business community and Walmart representatives. High-level meetings and negotiations indicate that the party is trying to work out compromise solutions that will help mitigate the negative impact on the end consumer. However, these efforts are still cautious and secretive, as public support for tariffs remains an important part of the rhetoric for part of the electorate. Against this backdrop, rumors are growing about possible reshuffles and a change in political course if pressure from the public and business continues to grow. The negative consequences of the tariff policy are being felt not only within the country, but also on the international stage. The global media are increasingly discussing the situation as an example of how political instability and unpredictable trade decisions can destroy the confidence of investors and partners. Publications in Singapore, London, and Frankfurt have called Trump's public statements against Walmart economic bullying and warned of the risks that such a policy poses to the global economy. International experts note that if the largest US retailer is forced to raise prices due to tariffs, this is a wake-up call for the entire global market, as the consequences could extend far beyond the US. Significant fluctuations are already being observed on the stock markets. Walmart's shares fell sharply after the public conflict with the administration, causing concern among investors. Analysts warn that such fluctuations could spread to other large retail companies, as well as industries closely linked to consumer demand. The price increases are expected to trigger changes in consumer habits, a decline in consumption, and as a result, a possible slowdown in economic growth in the coming quarters. Some economists predict that if effective measures are not taken to stabilize the situation, the market recovery could be delayed for years. At the same time, leading economic institutions, including university think tanks and international financial organizations, continue to publish alarming forecasts. In particular, a study by one of the leading economic think tanks which we will refer to as Atlas Economics, that showed that the average American household will lose more than $3,000 in purchasing power this year due to the effects of tariff policy. These losses affect all segments of the population, but low and middle-income families are particularly hard hit. The report also contains recommendations for mitigating the consequences, including reducing the tax burden on small businesses and developing support programs for vulnerable groups. At the heart of this conflict are not only companies and politicians, but also ordinary Americans, the shoppers, who bear the brunt of the burden. For them, price increases are not just statistics, but a daily reality that forces them to cut back on essentials, change their lifestyles, and rethink their plans for the future. In some communities, especially in rural and suburban areas where Walmart is the main supplier of goods, people are beginning to unite to find collective solutions and protect their interests. Support groups and initiatives for exchanging advice and resources have appeared on social media. Protest movements have also emerged, expressing dissatisfaction with both tariff policies and pressure on large retailers. Despite this, large retail chains continue to seek a balance between financial demands and social responsibility. They're trying to soften the blow to the most vulnerable segments of the population. This is how America's new economic landscape is taking shape, where politics and economics are so closely intertwined that any decision or statement can trigger a chain reaction with far-reaching consequences. The trade war, which began with promises to protect the national market and bring back jobs, has turned into a complex and painful process with no clear end in sight. Against this backdrop, Walmart remains a kind of indicator. If the largest retailer cannot cope with the challenges, then the situation as a whole requires serious rethinking and change. These events serve as a warning not only for the US but for the whole world. In a world of global interdependence and complex economic ties, that any trade conflict can hurt not only businesses and countries, but also ordinary people, whose daily lives become a battleground for economic and political interests. The question is whether the country's leaders will be able to find a balance and steer the situation in a constructive direction before the consequences become irreversible.